much. So for round one, we will be presenting case 3, Bring Out Your Dead. I'd just like to start off by saying thank you very much to the judges, the moderator, Loras College, and all of the spectators. So for this case, it's asking questions about morally responsible journalism, especially in regards to things like mass shootings. There have been a lot of questions about this case, specifically in terms of whether it's responsible to show very graphic images in journalism and what the responsibilities of journalists are. So we believe that in response to the question of the circumstances that it is morally permissible for news publications to display graphic material are that the material must be limited in its graphic content. There can be nothing but identifiable bodies or identifiable image. There should be no extreme gore, and we should be careful with publicating it with respect to the affected parties under principles of responsible journalism. And I will pass it off to our first one to mention.
All right, so first one we'll mention is responsible journalism. So although we recognize that displaying graphic material as a media strategy may be used to spur people into action, we can't neglect that this content can lead to serious harms for the victims as well as the viewers. When we see graphic content in the media this often, there is a natural response to want to know all of the information. There is science to back up this morbid curiosity. We naturally want to know all of the gory details. It's a survival instinct. However, these can lead to serious problems in violation of the victims. We will be pushing for information that we shouldn't necessarily have about somebody else's tragedy. In addition to this is also the problem of notoriety. So when this media is getting all of this attention, it can also lead to the issue of people, like journalists, pushing a little bit too far to get a story to attach to their name, as well as encouraging copycats. So one of the main issues with this is also desensitization. So according to the National Institute of Health, it has been proven that habitual exposure to graphic material does lead to a decreased anxiety arousal. What this basically says is that every time we do view this media, and the more frequently that we do view this media, that is the graphic images specifically, we are getting desensitized to it. To add on to this is also the issue with sensationalization. So, according to the World Health Organization, they actually have put out kind of a set of rules for what can be posted in terms of graphic content about specifically suicides. So what this entails is when reporting about suicides, people are not supposed to report too frequently. They can't include certain graphic photos and videos. And a couple other rules. They can't air it too frequently or attribute it to any one specific cause, such as mental health. That being said, in terms of reporting about suicide, this step to kind of limit what is posted about it has actually been shown to reduce kind of the imitation suicides. So in 2017, the National Institute of Health declared mass shootings as a serious problem. And that was when mass shootings were happening every 12.5 days. In 2024 alone, we had over 500 mass shootings. That being said, you can see how naturally this may lead to the problems of desensitization and also sensationalization. And kind of to build off of that, although we do recognize that there is a reason that news outlets might want to pursue this method of spurring people into action, we believe that the harms outweigh the potential benefit. And with that, I will pass it over to Tiana for a second moral dimension.
Great, thanks, Tiana. So our second moral dimension in this case is receptivity to citizen advocacy. The first main question that kind of pops up is, well, why is this relevant? In terms of this, receptivity to citizen advocacy is a measure of whether or not a government genuinely listens to, considers, and enacts policies advocated for by its citizens. When it comes to why is this relevant, the case alludes to this assumption that exceedingly graphic images are necessary to stoke the flames of people advocating for greater either gun control policies or policies against gun violence. However, we believe that this is fundamentally wrong. Since the Sandy Hook shooting in 2013, and well, before that, but since 2013 especially, there has been a great rise in advocacy for greater policies against gun violence. However, there has been a severe lack of movement in either direction as pushed by the government. So we know that greater policies against gun violence are called for because we know that a study done by Johns Hopkins University in 2023 that was nationally representative, they found that 90% of individuals, regardless of political party, call for background checks across the board before gun licensure is made. We also know that 84% of individuals, regardless of political party once more, believed in things like red flag laws, which are laws that allow law enforcement to temporarily confiscate a firearm if a judge deems that that individual may be a risk to themselves or others. Great pushes for things like this have been done throughout the various years. However, we have seen a continual failure of the government to enact actual policies that would make differences here. So now we must ask the question of what is stopping legislation from actually being passed. We believe that there are three main reasons. First, there's a lack of education on civil advocacy. Individuals, as a representative democracy, it's important that individuals know how they can make their voice heard to the democracy. There's both a lack of formal education on how individuals can get involved with their local political movements, as well as vote and interact with their senators and congressmen, as well as we would call for journalists in this case, instead of using graphic images, to have a greater push for what individuals should be advocating for and how they can be advocating for it. The second thing that's stopping individuals is lobbying and financial interests. We know that $12 million in 2024 alone was put forth by 11 parties lobbying against stricter gun control laws. In the last couple of years, the NRA has been a huge part of this. Lobbying and financial interest has added a large stopper in the movement of greater laws against gun violence. And finally, we know that the filibuster has added a large stopping point in moving legislation through the Senate. The filibuster, for those who don't know, requires 60 votes in the Senate instead of just a simple majority. And this bridge between 50 and 60 votes makes movement on policy relatively impossible, as movement on gun control policy would require bipartisan vote, which is very difficult to get with the filibuster. And with that, I'll pass it along for some counter arguments.
Thank you. So one may say that the problem of proximity illustrates how distant people may feel from these severe issues, and in order to get people to spur into action, we need these graphic images to show the reality of the issue. And this is a valid concern, as we want people to care about gun violence or mass shootings and other problems, and we want people to really try and solve the issue. But it's harsh to say that it's absolutely necessary for graphic images to be used to ignite action, especially considering how people are already spurring into action, people already do care, and considering the risk that it poses for desensitizing the public to graphic images. Consider true crime media. These horrific events and images are already absorbed and dismissed by the public, and this would be counterproductive to the goals of the journalism if we do so. It would be better to ignite conversation and action without disrespecting the victims and tarnishing the severity of the issue. Additionally, some people may say, what if by eliminating the filibuster, the government goes with a solution that we do not morally agree with? And this is a valid concern, as we want the right solution to address this issue. And while the government may choose an act that we morally disagree with, we must also recognize that this is an action. Action is better than inaction. Trial and error is better than inaction. And once we apply a solution, we can use empirical research to test whether it works and replace it when necessary. When the government is not thought out, we can flesh out all these solutions. With that, I'll pass it on to the conclusion.
Thank you. So just to conclude, wrap up a little bit, just to reiterate our stance to this question, under what circumstances is it ethically permissible for news outlets to display graphic material? And we believe that due to the potential harms of showing this graphic material, such as a lack of privacy or respect for victims and their families, and a level of desensitization to this violence, we believe that the material must be very limited within its scope of graphics, including any identifiable parts or features of the victim to be completely erased. And with that, we see the rest of our time and we look forward to all of your questions.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Salisbury University, for your insightful analysis of this case. We particularly like how you took a very robust consequentialist perspective, looking at the different consequences of showing explicit or violent material could have all these negative consequences. And I guess some questions that we have for you for, I guess, further elaboration. Pictures carry great power, and oftentimes in different historical cases, we can see how you can write about a situation a lot, but it's when people see the reality of a picture, it can really spur them to action. So you talked a little bit about the problem of proximity, and yes, sometimes that can be a type of fallacious reasoning, and using an image is an appeal to emotion, but as emotional creatures, humans, pictures carry great power and emotions carry great power. So I guess the question that we would raise to you, you mentioned the continual failure of the government to implement impactful strategies, and you said that these images aren't necessary for this efficacy. However, since pictures do carry great power, how would you wrap that into your argument? Do you think there is some use for graphic imagery to spur action, or do you think we should completely restrict this imagery?
Yes, we are in full agreement that it should not be in all cases that a news outlet should publish these horrific images. One thing that we wanted to inquire you guys about was to the role of informed consent in approaching this. We feel that, as Dominic discussed, that images do carry great power, as seen in the civil rights movement, as seen in recent political demonstrations. And though we also want to acknowledge that the role of a journalist is not inherently political, we do feel that they have a responsibility to present the truth, occasionally which can only be conveyed through use of an image. So if we agree that if a child, for example, were to be watching the evening news, we don't feel that that child could adequately give consent or should be seeing those images, as they haven't developed the cognitive, social, or emotional skills to be able to handle viewing such a thing. Though we question in the modern world with easy access to websites where perhaps someone were to have an ability to give informed consent, as has already been seen on social media when discussing sensitive topics. If someone were to give informed consent, would you guys be okay then with them viewing that image due to the necessity of its emotional power?
Yes, I guess going off of that, I think another important perspective to look at is the families of victims as well. Let's suppose you lost a loved one and you want to make sure that you want to have, I guess, a sense of closure, so to speak, by advocacy through perhaps using appropriate images of your loved one and giving consent to the press to use those images. So if we have consent on the side of both victims, families, as well as viewers through a robust system of agreeing to see the violent imagery, would you say that changes your perspective at all, or do you think it still carries too many negative consequences? Additionally, yes.
I think that constitutes all of our questions for you guys, so thank you for your insightful analysis.
Yes, thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for those questions. They were obviously very well thought out. And jumping right in, I completely agree with you. A picture is worth 1,000 words. We've heard it a million times. They can be extremely effective in conveying a sort of message. As you said, it's an emotional appeal. It spurs people. It makes them upset. It makes them angry. It makes them want to take action. And that is very important. You brought up the civil rights movement and how images and even videos at the time were newly being spread around, and people were able to actually see the level of violence and horrific actions that were taking place. And to that, I think we would go back to kind of our stance on this case is that images have a time and a place. Graphic images have a time and a place. However, the level of graphicness does not need to be extremely gory or extremely graphic. And we would go back to saying that any imagery that displays identifiable features of the victim or anything like that, we don't think it's permissible for journalists to use as kind of a blanket ideal. And again, with the civil rights movement, we're in a digital age now. We have access to anything we want at the tip of our fingers at all times. We have access to so much information constantly. And we think that just an absolute influx of images of violence and gun violence and death would just not be productive to the goal of legislation and action that would kind of limit these types of violent acts. So I'll pass it over to my teammates to jump in.
And to kind of add on to that question, like Sophie was saying, images do contain great power. However, the venue for using this power is not only through graphic images. We believe that through the use of creative journalism, you can accomplish a lot of the same ideas. For example, in terms of school shooting, images of a populated classroom before and a less populated classroom after can be equally, if not more powerful than a graphic image that contributes to the dehumanization of victims by viewing them as bodies that are not relatable to the viewer. Instead, we would offer things like interviews with possibly parents of victims and other things that more sensitively address the matter at hand, as well as offer a viable means of connection between the viewer and the tragedy. And then I'll pass it off to Gianna.
Alright, so I wanted to address your question of informed consent because it was something we honestly gave a lot of thought towards, and I think that we settled on kind of the concept of when you do have the consent of a victim's family, we question whether or not it is truly informed consent. You can't really obtain consent of the dead or the victims themselves, and when you are getting the informed consent of a victim's family, we would like to say that it's not really informed consent. You know, what if we do want them to be remembered as the family, but I would say that it is kind of playing on the emotions of them at the time, and it is more so exploiting grief in a way, rather than getting full informed consent.
Yeah, and then kind of just to wrap up, we know that these images could be a tool, but it's a tool that comes at a great cost, and it's a tool that's not necessary. We know that, as you said, truth can only be conveyed through images. We would push back and say that the truth does not rely on images. Emotions do not rely on images. We can, through other uses of journalism, we can portray and convey powerful emotions that can advocate for change. Ultimately, we know that graphic images are not the only avenue for telling the truth. And therefore, we would advocate for other, more sensitive, more creative venues that can advocate even better for the matter. And with that, we see the rest of our time, and we're looking forward to the judges' questions.
So I'll ask the first question. I want to talk, I thought a lot about the connection between journalism and truth came out that I thought was really important and fascinating. And I want to go back to the last thing you said. You said truth does not rely on images. And I want to talk about that in relation to the Derek Chauvin case. I think there is a very strong argument to be made that George Floyd's killer, Derek Chauvin, did not go to prison because the people around him saw what happened, or because someone read a transcript of what happened, but because we all saw the video of what happened. I'd like you to comment on that in response to your statement that truth doesn't rely on images.
So we think that that is a wonderful question, and that is absolutely a case where it might seem that our principals disagree with some of the ideas that might have represented and allowed this person to be in prison. But I think one of the most important distinctions here is the situation where this is an individual crime that's been committed by one person against another, whereas a mass shooting, almost always, there are very few mass shootings where the perpetrator of the crime has not been convicted. We understand that this is a person who has committed a crime where they have killed several people or injured several people, and this is something that, in publicizing these images, it would not achieve the effect of putting this person to justice, where in the specific case of George Floyd, this was a very unique situation with police brutality where it was required for these images to be publicized, and we think that perhaps in situations of non-mass shootings, it might differ a little bit in the type of content we would be willing to share with the public.
Does it change your principles for not sharing it?
In terms of the principles for sharing it, we do believe that there should still be respect to the victims, respect to the victim's family and sensitivity to the situation in general. In terms of George Floyd's related family, we might assume that they would have advocated for this to be shared. However, the actions that were committed by George Floyd's killer weren't necessarily, that were caught in video and that were shared, weren't necessarily the gory aftermath, they were the committing of the actions in and of itself. And in terms of bringing George Floyd's killer to justice, the visualization of him committing those actions were able to allow us to hold him accountable for committing those actions. But on a widespread scale, we don't believe that the graphic images are necessary in the same way.
Thank you.
So, I want to piggyback on that question because you just mentioned the gory aftermath. I love the example of Derek Chauvin, but I was actually thinking, this shows how old I am. I was thinking Emmett Till, okay? I want to think about Emmett Till and Emmett Till's mother. Now that was a terrible image, and she wanted the world to see what had been done to her boy. So I'm wondering if you can think about, does that shift how you understand, how would you talk to Emmett Till's mother?
Would you provide some context?
Okay, so this is the I don't know what year it is either.
64.
Thank you. 1964 was when I was born, okay? Emmett Till was murdered horribly, and then I think left in the river, and looked just, the body was terrible. But they did publish this because Emmett Till's mother decided that it was important for the world to see what people had done to her son. So, does it change the way you think about informed consent? If a parent comes forward and says, no, Dad, I want people to see what they did. And I understand that I'm grieving, but I'm so angry that I want to move the needle on this. If someone is convinced that they can move the needle, do they have a right to do that?
I think this question becomes especially hazy when we consider informed consent of someone else providing consent for another individual. I don't, again, know the specific details of this case. I don't know Emmett Till's age or specific relationship, but if this was a grown adult who was capable of providing their own consent, I think consent of the victim is in question by allowing this to happen. We cannot in any way provide or obtain consent from an individual after their death unless there is some kind of will or some kind of a document. Even if the family is vehemently in support of providing this image, we do not have the capabilities to provide consent from the dead, and I think there is some ethical consideration to that point.
I'd like to jump in here. While I agree that there are some questions about the consent of the victim, I think that this case in particular, just how brutally he was murdered, and the imagery, she had an open casket as well at his funeral, so that she made people go up and look at him. And it was a vital moment in the civil rights movement that woke up like white Americans who refused to pay attention to the brutality being done against Black Americans. And it was a crucial moment in the civil rights movement, and the publication of those images were vital in that case. And I think to that we would say that while these images in cases like this can be very, very emotionally important, and they were in this case, we are in a different time. We're in a different era now. We are in an era where that was a very unique and new thing for people to see in their newspapers, on their TV screens when they first started to get them. And we are no longer in an age where that type of brutality is something that we haven't seen on a daily basis. I think we are past the point where enough shock has been vital enough and has done enough to spur people to action, and along with victims' privacy and trying to tamp down desensitization, we want to encourage journalists now, with that consideration of just how easy it is to see graphic images like this, to really consider when it is necessary. Emmett Till, that was necessary. And we ask journalists now to take that same consideration when they are posting images like this.
brief.
So I kind of want to press you a little bit more on the issue of informed consent. I used to teach public school, and so it wasn't rare to have a school shooting threat, and a lot of mass shootings are school shootings. And something that I said and heard other colleagues say during that time was, I mean, not in a written document, but like we voiced it to each other sincerely, was like, if I die in a school shooting, I think the thing that would be respectful to me is to share that. And I think that is informed consent, right? Because that's the person saying it prior to their death, saying, if this were to happen to me, I want people to see what happened to me. Because it's not weird to predict that you might be in a school shooting if you teach public school, unfortunately. So how would a case like that change when colleagues can vouch and say, no, this teacher really did say that what she wanted if she died in this manner was for it to be shared?
So ideally in that case, I think we would, first of all, want to make sure that there was some form of written consent. And unfortunately, you're correct, this is something that individuals are thinking about. I remember having similar conversations with my friends in high school. And given that I have always been a person in favor of political advocacy, I much would have sided with some of those colleagues themselves as well. However, I also think that those images, that information about someone's death does not equate to the sharing of a graphic image that depicts their death specifically. We think that there may be moments of, oh, I was just talking to this colleague moments before and telling their story of what happened, as well as relying on that kind of emotional advocacy. However, we believe due to the inherent kind of harms of the risk of desensitization and, on the flip side, sensationalization of these images, we have no way of preventing media corporations from exploiting the consent of these individuals for a further profit. And that's our greater concern, because while myself in high school or the teachers in high school may have believed that those images could have been used in that way, we also believe that they could have been exploited just as easily.
You have about 30 seconds.
No one that I can ask in 30 seconds.
Let's call it a rounder natural history, which it is. Thank you, Loras.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Salisbury University, our moderator, our judges, and all of our fantastic viewers for your time and attention. We are looking at case study 10, which has to do with hostile architecture and its undue impact upon vulnerable populations, in particular homeless populations. And in answering the question, is it fair to prioritize the comfort and safety of certain groups, such as shoppers and residents, over the basic needs and rights of homeless populations to rest in public spaces? We're looking at the ethical considerations of higher level versus lower level, you might say basic rights. And in addressing this question, we're using both consequentialist and deontological lenses. Look at both the consequences of hostile architecture as well as the rules or basic duties in place. And lastly, we're going to be wrapping up our presentation from a Rawlsian perspective to look at this cases if we have no stakes in the game. So starting from a consequentialist perspective, we identify various stakeholders, in this case, including homeless populations, the general public, businesses, and the government, and we look at different costs and benefits for each of these stakeholders. So from the perspective of homeless population, hostile architecture carries many costs, including no area to rest, leading to undue mental strain, unable to sleep. Additionally, oftentimes hostile architecture funnels homeless populations into more dangerous areas of the city, leading to increased danger as well as exposure to drugs. And there are little benefits for homeless populations with the implementation of hostile architecture. From the perspective of the government, this case mentions the idea of broken windows theory, which is basically the idea that if something appears safer, it will be safer. So a lot of governmental officials come from this perspective that if our streets look cleaner, if they look more inviting, it will increase business and will make citizens feel safer. However, it does carry significant costs for certain populations. The government should be for all people, whether they have homes or not. So public spaces, with implementation of this hostile architecture, carries the cost of not involving the whole population and making it accessible to them. From the perspective of business owners, this question is a bit more complicated, we think, because this is private property and we have the benefit of being able to implement architecture in a way that suits the needs of businesses. For example, some businesses may implement various lighting that is unfriendly to have shoppers go through at a faster rate, and this is a business technique that helps have the right percentage of customers in a certain place. Additionally, hostile architecture carries the benefit of making businesses appear more desirable to shop at. If it's desirable to shop at, people will come there and they'll make money. But of course, we do have the cost, the moral cost of potentially excluding part of the population. For the general public, we sort of have a balance between these two perspectives. That yes, we want to have residential areas and business areas that look inviting on the one hand, but on the other hand, there is this concern for vulnerable populations, as well as a small impact on citizens as well. Hostile architecture in public spaces does have a small impact, like in our example with Ian, the city construction worker, who goes to get his salad. However, there's no place to sit, so he has to consent to a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So in conclusion, from a consequentialist perspective, we're weighing all these costs and benefits, and there are many different stakeholders in this case. It can sometimes be difficult to determine which costs and benefits are more important than others. However, we say that the ones that carry more weight are the ones that have more impact, because the costs of hostile architecture carry undue impact for vulnerable populations. We say from a consequentialist perspective, implementing this type of architecture carries more costs than benefits.
In assessing this case from deontology, we've come to a similar conclusion. We recognize, of course, in the case of business owners, the right to private property. But as per the content of the question, as if some rights are more important than others, we strongly disagree that individuals' comfort, particularly in public settings, supersedes the rights of the homeless population. First of all, we want to reference the second formulation of the categorical imperative, which addresses and states that human beings ought to be the end and not ever a means of any particular maxim. The way in which these barriers are approaching treats human beings as if they're animals, that they're something meant to be corralled and controlled through some sort of external carrot and stick force. But our concern is that the basic rights are being forgotten in reference to other people's comfort and personal sense of security. We fully believe in the Kantian tradition and in Kantian-like traditions such as Catholic social teaching, that there is a broad right to safety and shelter that everyone universally has. And we think that particularly for the poor and vulnerable, people that are in a minority population, people that have been deprived of some sort of privilege, that they have a particular right, they have a particular degree to which society ought to afford them that right. So in the case of the Kantian tradition here, in assessing this from deontology, we feel strongly that the rights to shelter, though we believe that options should be taken to provide a better shelter than a park bench, should be taken, that those opportunities should be invested in, that this is a grave violation of these people's rights, and that the behavior should not continue.
Yeah, sort of going off of what Patrick said with this carrot/stick analogy, it's basically the idea that it's an analogy used to say to goad social action, you ought to have both a carrot and a stick. The analogy is you have a donkey, he goes for the carrot, that's the positive, and you have the stick, which is the negative. So far we have an undue use of negativity, a negative means of dealing with homeless populations. We need more positive needs. And John here will address that a bit through Rawlsian analysis.
Turning now to Rawlsian analysis and specifically going behind the veil of ignorance, which for the uninformed is where you step back from your own reality and you go behind a veil of ignorance in which you do not know from where you will come, nor what you will have, and essentially what social status you were born into. So looking from there, we aim to create a more equitable and fair society for all. And in this, a ideal society, an equitable society, would not want the rights of some trounced for the comfort of others. It would, as we do not know where we will come, none of us would want to be in the position where our rights are, and essentially the quality of life is being used to merely benefit the comfort and appeal of others. Additionally, if you are born in as a person who uses these tools, the same tools can be used against you as hostile architecture can also be used to force you out of businesses quicker and create lessen your own enjoyment in doing these things in shopping or eating or what have you. So in that, from behind the veil of ignorance, we would want to support lessening of hostile architecture in favor of better solutions to help the homeless population. Now, one may object that there are solutions like homeless shelters, and that more of these would simply solve the problem, but these places are, in many cases, just as bad as leaving people on the streets. They're often unsafe, and many in the community do not want to go to these places as they are just unsafe and they are better off on the streets. So, to offer a conclusion, we have discussed the key stakeholders in this case from the perspective of consequentialism, and we have looked at the rights rights that need to be upheld through the lens of deontology, and we have concluded that hostile architecture is more costly than it would be worth. Thank you. We see the rest of our time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. We agree with the vast majority of your case. We do think that the major answer to the stance is that that we should not be prioritizing the comfort and the safety of certain groups of basic needs of homeless populations. However, one question we did have with your case is on the topic of hostile architecture specifically, you seem to speak of it generally as a bad thing. And while we agree that hostile architecture in the specific situations where it's mentioned in this case to discourage homeless people is unethical and immoral, we were wondering if you think hostile architecture as a concept is implicitly immoral, and if there are ways that it can be used for the overall benefit of the most amount of people.
And I'll pick that up, and by hostile architecture, the overall definition is any architecture that seeks to influence human behavior. So this is ticket lines at movie theaters, or maybe like regular benches in parks, just anything that encourages human behavior, not necessarily anti-homeless architecture. And then I just had a few general questions. My basic question is that, do you believe that housing is a fundamental human right? And if so, what is you talked a lot about stakeholders and that governments and businesses should not be implementing hostile architecture, but then what is their duty? Is it the duty of the government to provide housing for everyone? Is it the duty of the government just to prevent businesses from having anti-homeless architecture? And then what's the duty of businesses? If they do not want unhoused populations near their businesses or near their customers, and you think hostile architecture is not the answer to that, do they not have an obligation to then try to go to City Hall, go to their politicians, do anything that they can to end homelessness at its source? And I think that's it.
Yeah, and then kind of building off of that question, but taking it in a different way, you mentioned business owners specifically as a stakeholder. Given that there are approximately 650,000 unhoused individuals in the United States and only an estimated approximately 350,000 beds available to homeless individuals, there's an expected overflow that will be in the public sphere. You also mentioned that there was an interest in protecting vulnerable populations. And I was kind of wondering about the cross-section between these two facts. Given that women are the primary target audience for most retailers, they're also most likely to feel the most unsafe when confronted with visible homelessness. And given that visible homelessness is a failure of the government, why should businesses in particular be held accountable for feeling the negative effects that visible homelessness in front of their buildings would provide in terms of consumers of their retailers?
Yeah, and I just had a quick question. You guys briefly mentioned the broken windows theory and explained it as it might solve the issue of no more unhoused people on business property. But I would like to hear more about what you guys think about the issues with the broken windows theory through your position. The broken windows theory does not actually address the root problem of homelessness, such as inaccessible housing, poverty, etc. And so I was wondering, does the broken windows theory not dehumanize unhoused individuals by not even addressing the bigger societal issue of homelessness, and what you guys would make of that?
Alright, and then I just had a couple of more so clarifying questions, but I know that you said that we should encourage allocating resources towards maybe like park benches and stuff like that, if that kind of is helping that problem. But I was wondering, wouldn't it be more productive to allocate these resources towards social security, job security, and things that actually like kind of help the root cause? And then a follow up on that, I know John, you mentioned that like a lot of times it might seem like they're just better off on the streets, but at least homeless shelters do provide some sort of like a roof over your head, some sense of security. If the homeless population keeps getting kicked off of park benches or keeps being victim to hostile architecture, then aren't homeless shelters providing more security than that? And with that, I believe we see the rest of our time.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Salisbury University, for your insightful questions. I think you bring up a couple of really important distinctions that we should address more. Your first question had to do with hostile architecture in general. Is it implicitly bad or immoral, or is it just being used in an improper manner? And we respond that we don't think hostile architecture in itself is immoral, and it may have actually some very useful applications. Like sometimes in businesses, it is necessary to have like a ticketing line that funnels people through. It's very useful in that sense, so you don't have people bumping into each other. We are arguing that in this case, it is just being unduly used. In our carrot stick analogy, we have too much of the stick rather than the carrot, and we're using hostile architecture in this way as a means of basically covering up the homeless issue. It's a means of providing an aesthetic, you might say, band-aid on what is a deep wound that needs to be dealt with in a more just and more just manner. I guess kind of going off of that, John, do you want to address that last question?
So, in terms of homeless shelters being better than nothing, I think it is very, I guess we think it is very case dependent, in which that if you have, in a lot of cases, if you have a issue, you will be turned away from the shelter. So in that case, it is equivalent to nothing. And I think shelters themselves just tend to expound on it's easier for violent things to happen because I think that part of it is that they are underfunded, probably understaffed, like many things are. So I think it's easier for violence to happen there. So I think it's more of a choice on the part of the individual as to if it is really better than nothing. Really better than nothing. If the roof over the head is better than nothing.
Yeah, I guess I think you very rightly said that we need to have more reallocation of resources. We aren't saying that homeless shelters are immoral or ineffective in themselves, but rather their current state is often they're underfunded and not as useful as they can be. So we would like to see more resources go into these shelters to make them a more positive place and a more beneficial means, or carrot means, so to speak, of assisting homeless populations.
I want to address a couple other points that were brought up. You guys asked about broken windows theory. Our case does not endorse broken windows theory. Rather, we wanted to point to a justification that is often used for these policies. We feel that in the event that it violates people's fundamental rights, we explicitly do not endorse broken windows theory, and that it's an unfair justification for a violation of people's rights. Another question that came up was the role of women feeling unsafe in the presence of retailers. We do feel that the right to ownership of private property still applies, as we discussed, that retailers ought to take necessary action to protect the people in there. And obviously, any sort of assault or any unfortunate circumstance such as that, we feel that that is another violation of a right that businesses and the government alike ought to take the highest degree of action possible to prevent.
Yeah, I think it's important to distinguish as well between public and private rights and duties. The government, by having public spaces, has a certain duty to care for all populations, and private spaces and businesses, we could see the implementation of hostile architecture being much more applicable, as it's a private space and you have a right to do with private spaces as you will, in addition to having it be best to serve your main stakeholders, your business and the customers involved in that business. So I think that's another important distinction to make between public and private property.
And ultimately, in the sense of the public, we feel that to protect people's fundamental rights, the government ought to take the highest degree of action possible. Though you guys analogize that the government could force people into doing everything they can to help the homeless, we feel that the most reasonable degree of action the government can take, as we discussed, is increased funding of shelters, improving on how we can incentivize and fix these places and not violate people's rights in doing so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to actually press a little bit of a question that they brought up. Is housing a fundamental human right? And if it is a shelter housing? Or does housing being a fundamental right mean real housing like an apartment or a home, or shelters qualify?
That's a really good question. I think it's a very complex moral and economic question. It's very easy to say in an ideal world we would each have some sort of housing that we can afford. It becomes a much more difficult question figuring out the logistics in our current economic system. And we proposed homeless shelters as one means, but we don't want to say it's the only means. There could be many other better means that perhaps we haven't thought of, or creative means of housing as well.
As we've discussed, I think that we agree that at least shelter is a fundamental human right. That at least people ought to be able to sleep in security and peace to the best of the ability the government and the public can work for in doing so. As for the question of housing, it again goes back to the question of what degree can the government do to maintain that right. We agree that housing is a right, that people have the right to make a home and to live as they desire in doing so. Though, in addressing the question of this case, we again refer back to the ability to provide that right versus the degree to which we believe people are owed that right. In the case of these benches, it's an example of where the government has a much greater ability to not violate that right in that way as compared to providing housing for all.
Yeah, so in sum, I guess we have an idealism versus realism divide, that we ought to strive for this idealist goal to the best of our ability, while also realizing realistically the limitations of our system.
So this is the place I'm imagining for this. I am imagining a neighborhood in New Orleans that I stayed in that had this public square surrounded by all of these really beautiful houses, and had this public square with a lot of benches that had these impediments so that people couldn't sleep in them. But in New Orleans, there's a huge homeless population, right? So I want to think about that and imagine being someone in one of those houses. Let's say I'm just, first of all, I'm younger and I have kids, and I've had a bad experience in my own life where, I don't know, maybe I was assaulted when I was younger, so I'm carrying a certain amount of mental baggage. So then I started thinking about how I see your argument in favor of the homeless, people having rights, certainly key rights here, and you wanna prevent undue mental strain. You don't want them funneled to more dangerous areas of the city. But what if there are people in those homes that feel like, well, this is undue mental strain? Now, I'm not arguing that they necessarily have, rights that supersede homeless people, but I wonder if you'd return to your argument about higher level and lower level basic rights, and think about, how would you talk to that woman in the house if she was upset and saying, I don't feel safe, I want these benches the way they are?
That's a very good question. And it once again brings up the very real concern is that each of these stakeholders have really valid concerns and valid costs and benefits in this case. And we do concur that there is a right to safety for other populations as well. So once again, we want to affirm that there ought to be alternatives. We don't necessarily say that hostile architecture in itself is evil. Perhaps in some cases it can be useful and necessary in certain communities. But we think that there appears to be an over-reliance on hostile architecture without providing any alternatives to homeless populations. So in your example, in this community, perhaps they do require hostile architecture for the population there to keep it safe, but there ought to be alternatives for homeless populations in that community as well. So the government has various duties to all of its populations and needs to balance those duties. So we recognize that this is a very fine balancing act, and it's a very complex issue as well.
I think one facet worth acknowledging is that we're one of those people causing some sort of immediate harm, or they to be harassing the people that live there. We recognize that there is an additional right there that the government has to protect, but that were someone to be sleeping alone, not causing any direct harm, that would be then a violation. It would not violate the rights of the homeowners as you described. But
yeah, and it's also important to not unfairly stigmatize homeless populations as well. Yes, there is an aesthetic value that a lot of communities want to uphold, but once again, we say the priority is the humanity of the person rather than the aesthetic value of the city, while still keeping the safety of homeowners in consideration, of course.
So I want you to clear up something for me, because it seemed sort of to stick out in your argument. You keep saying business owners, this is private property, they have the right to do whatever they want. And I want you to talk a little bit about the distinction between legal rights and moral rights. So with a few very narrow exceptions, I have the legal right to lie and break promises to my husband. But to say that I have the moral right to do that is pretty sketchy. And so when it comes to the rights of businesses, I want you to tell me your distinction between a business's legal rights and their moral rights in regards to hostile architecture.
That's a really good question, actually. In this question of legal versus moral rights, we believe that businesses have a base legal obligation. However, an ethical business goes beyond that base obligation. It can be useful to bring in other theories of ethics, such as Catholic social teachings, to analyze this question. We come from a Catholic college, so we often like to refer to that. But Catholic social teaching says that we have a special preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, and that both the government and individuals have this responsibility to care for the poor and vulnerable. So we would say that an ethical business would take homeless populations in as another stakeholder within their community. And ethical businesses as well attempt to serve their communities and not just themselves. As a business owner, you look at various stakeholders, including your employees, your overall business, your customers, but also the community around them is another important stakeholder. So while we say that the government has perhaps a higher moral duty due to their position, businesses do have some moral duty as well to care for the community.
Thank you.
We have 2 minutes if there are any follow-up questions. No? All right, then I think we should call the round. Thank you both.